The U.S. has moved in more troops and materiel recently to support Iraqi military efforts against the group. At the same time, there is political turmoil in Baghdad, where the government of Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi is facing challenges from rival Shia groups. For more, I'm joined now by the Washington Post's Baghdad bureau chief, Loveday Morris. She just returned from the front lines in northern Iraq. Loveday Morris, thanks for joining us. You were near the front lines of this battle. Describe the situation there. What did you see?
What we are seeing on the front lines at the moment is an increased U.S. troop presence outside of the more established Iraqi bases. The line where I was at, south of Mosul, now there's a U.S. artillery base, which is relatively close to the front lines. And the problem with these front lines are that they're scrappy lines. You have suicide bombers penetrating the lines regularly. So as we see more troops, more U.S. troops coming, there were more announced by the president, there is an increased risk for them.
The Iraqi army is gearing up to advance on yet another Daesh stronghold after successful mop-up operations in the western province of Anbar. Iraqi soldiers are now preparing to liberate the northern city of Mosul from the Takfiri terrorists. Thousands of soldiers have been deployed to a base in the town of Mahmur in Iraq's Kurdistan region. The operation is initially aimed at cutting Daesh's supply lines between Mosul and Kirkuk province. The Iraqi army will then start to target the terrorists' positions on the outskirts of Mosul and push their way into the city. The Iraqi forces have already clawed back much of the territory occupied by Daesh, including Ramadi, the provincial capital of the Anbar province. They also inflicted heavy losses on the terrorists near the city of Fallujah in Anbar province. Mosul is expected to be the most difficult battle against the Takfiri group.
Going to Iraq, my question is, as you have added more to that, and what do you think can be accomplished in the battle against ISIS in Iraq before your term of office ends?
What I've said to our Secretary of Defense and our generals is, let's continue to resource what works. And as we see the Iraqis willing to fight and gaining ground, let's make sure that we're providing them more support. We're not doing the fighting ourselves, but when we provide training, when we provide special forces who are backing them up, when we are gaining intelligence, working with the coalitions that we have, what we've seen is that we can continually tighten the noose. My expectation is that by the end of the year, we will have created the conditions whereby Mosul will eventually fall.
The fact is, in Iraq, Daesh fighters have not been on the offensive in months. They are losing ground, including more than 40% of the territory that they once controlled in Iraq. We see increasing evidence that terrorists are disobeying orders, fleeing their positions, and even trying to escape by hiding among civilians. Daesh is on the defensive. That is clear. But its capacity to inflict suffering, regrettably, still remains. I want to reiterate the support of President Obama, Vice President Biden, myself as Secretary, and the entire administration in the United States for Prime Minister Abadi, who has demonstrated critical leadership in the face of enormous security, economic, and political challenges. What we certainly did indicate to him, because it is in our interest, was that it is important to have political stability. And it is important to have a unified and functioning government as rapidly as possible in order to move forward so that all of these operations are not affected and so that we give confidence to the coalition and to those who are thinking about supporting the stabilization of those communities already liberated, that the government is in place and ready to work appropriately in order to make that stabilization process effective. At this point in time, I'm not aware that there's some additional request. I think there's been some discussion about some additional operations, specifically from DOD, but there was no request from Prime Minister Abadi today for some new infusion of troops. at this point in time, and nor did we discuss that.
Thanks for being here. We are working with the Iraqi forces to prepare forces for the envelopment and ultimately the seizure of Mosul. Absolutely. We expect it to be like Ramadi in the sense that the Iraqi security forces, under the control of the government of Iraq, Prime Minister Abadi, will be in the lead, but we will be enabling them. And just to get to your specific question, will we do more to enable them as they go north? Yes, we fully expect to do that. And when we have the opportunities, the time, the place, and a strategic effect that only the United States can do, we've indicated a willingness to do more, and I expect that we'll have opportunities to do that as we move north.
More troops are heading to Iraq. The announcement coming during a surprise visit to the country by Defense Secretary Ash Carter. The secretary pledging an additional 200 troops and Apache helicopters to help fight ISIS. He has a series of meetings with high-ranking officials, including the Prime Minister and top U.S. commanders there in Iraq. Later, Carter will meet with the troops already stationed there.
In the Middle East this morning, Vice President Joe Biden promises the United States and its allies will squeeze the heart of ISIS. Biden spoke at an Air Force base in the United Arab Emirates. In northern Iraq, Americans are helping local troops gear up for a new offensive against ISIS. Holly Williams and her crew got caught up in the chaos outside Iraq's second largest city. Holly, good morning.
Good morning. Iraqi and American leaders have been talking about recapturing Mosul for over a year now. It's still not clear when the long-awaited battle will actually happen, but we visited Kurdish troops outside the city who are readying for the offensive. 20 miles from Mosul, Kurdish soldiers open fire. They've spotted what they think are two ISIS gunmen moving towards their post. And it's no wonder they're nervous here. The day before our visit, there was a coordinated ISIS attack. The Kurdish soldiers fought the extremists back and told us they killed nearly 100 ISIS fighters. And that's ISIS over there. They're only about a mile away. We crossed into no man's land to inspect the aftermath. This is all that's left of a Humvee detonated by a suicide bomber. It's blown to smithereens. ISIS will doubtless use the same ruthless tactics to defend Mosul. ISIS is thought to have several thousand fighters in Mosul, but now they're stopping civilians from leaving the city, which means effectively that they have more than 1 million human shields. When ISIS captured Mosul nearly 2 years ago, many people cheered their convoy in the street. But General Najim al-Jabori, who's leading preparations for the Mosul offensive, told us he's counting on the help of civilians.
I think about 75 or 80% from the people in Mosul, they will support us.
80% will support you, but 20% are still supporting ISIS.
Yeah, with ISIS.
The general told us the fight for Mosul could last several months. Iraq says the recent battle to reclaim Ramadi left 80% of the city destroyed.
There hasn't been a lot of talk in the campaign recently about Iraq, but that may change after this week. A surprise attack killed a U.S. Navy SEAL Tuesday in Iraq. Petty Officer First Class Charles Keating responded to a call for help from Kurdish allies and American advisors who were being overrun by ISIS. Charlie D'Agata is in Iraq tonight.
Only 20 minutes into the battle, U.S. forces knew they were in trouble. They called for backup. Then, things only got worse. The Navy SEALs rescue team found themselves pinned down in an intense firefight with over 120 ISIS militants. Kurdish soldiers and their U.S. advisors were forced to take cover. The attack seemed to come from nowhere. And Petty Officer First Class Charles Keating IV was among those shot in the gun battle. Even the Black Hawk helicopters that were called in to evacuate Keating came under fire. ISIS launched the surprise attack at around 7:30 near the village of Tel Askaf. According to U.S. officials, the militants flooded in from the south, piercing the front line with 3 suicide truck bombs and bulldozers. The Americans fought for nearly 2 hours before finally getting away. U.S. officials told us the area had been relatively quiet for a month and was considered low risk. It just shows how the front line against ISIS can change in a flash, Scott, and how close U.S. forces are to it. But U.S. military officials here stress that those Navy SEALs only came forward to back up the Americans and would not have joined the firefight otherwise.
U.S. Navy SEAL killed by ISIS in Iraq. ABC's chief global affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz, who traveled to that region with new reporting now on the attack that took that American life.
Today, firefights throughout northern Iraq. The one that left the Navy SEAL dead, a coordinated ISIS attack on U.S.-backed Peshmerga forces. ISIS fighters penetrating the front line with suicide truck bombs like these, then opening fire where the SEAL had just arrived. Locals saying he had been in this vehicle. After he took a direct hit, a medevac helicopter was called in, taking heavy fire as well. The crew escaped injury. The Peshmerga did manage to push back the ISIS forces with the help of American fighter jets and armed drones.
It shows you it's a serious fight that we have to wage in Iraq.
And Americans are getting closer to the fight every day. Like the SEAL, they now travel outside the larger bases to smaller outposts, like the ones we visited recently, as they prepare to take back the ISIS-held town of Mosul. The return of ground troops to Iraq has been called a non-combat mission by the White House, but today's death was the 3rd American combat death in the last 2 years, and with U.S. forces now closer to the fight, it will probably not be the last.
This individual who was unfortunately was killed today in northern Iraq was operating about 2 miles behind this line that was maintained by Iraqi forces just north of Mosul. Secretary Carter earlier today described this death as a combat death. That's accurate. This is an individual who is not in a combat mission, but he was in a dangerous place, and his position came under attack. He was armed, trained, and prepared to defend himself. Unfortunately, he was killed, and he was killed in combat, but that was not part of his mission. His mission was specifically to offer advice and assistance to those Iraqi forces that were fighting for their own country. Individuals who are in a train, advise, and assist mission are equipped for combat. They've been trained for combat. And the reason for that is simply they're in a dangerous place. In some cases, they're just a couple of miles behind the front lines. And in this tragic situation in northern Iraq that transpired earlier today, you had an individual who was not in a combat mission come under withering attack from enemy forces. He was in a combat situation. He was prepared to deal with it, but unfortunately under a complex attack, he was killed, and it's tragic.
This dramatic new video showing U.S. rockets taking revenge on ISIS terrorists in Iraq. You can see clouds of dust and debris filling the streets of Mosul, an ISIS stronghold after the death of our Marine last week. The terrorist group took control there in 2014.
An ISIS commander blamed for the death of a U.S. Marine was killed today by a drone strike in Iraq. The ISIS member was said to be behind the rocket attack that killed Staff Sergeant Louis Cardin and wounded 8 other Marines last month. Also engaged in the fight against ISIS with the help of U.S. forces are Kurdish soldiers, the Peshmerga. Holly Williams has more on this.
For nearly 2 years, Iraq's Kurdish fighters have led the battle against ISIS, known as the Peshmerga, which means one who faces death. These Kurdish soldiers have helped claw back towns, villages and territory from the extremists. Nearly 1,400 Peshmerga have lost their lives. In a war they're fighting without enough body armour or helmets to go round, with very few heavy weapons, and against an enemy that uses suicide bombs and booby traps.
The Kurds are not only fighting for themselves, but for the rest of the world.
Masroor Barzani is the head of the Security Council in Iraqi Kurdistan, a region that's been plunged into economic crisis by the falling price of oil, with consequences for the Peshmerga.
They haven't been paid for months at least.
They haven't been paid for 4 months.
No.
And they're fighting ISIS on the front line.
They are. They believe in the cause. But unfortunately, they have families. They have people to take care of. And we don't know for how much longer they can stand in the front lines without being paid.
The Kurds say the war against ISIS has cost them billions of dollars, not only in bullets and fighters' pay, but because they've opened their doors to outsiders. You've taken in 1.8 million people
Yes.
who have fled ISIS.
Yes.
That's a big burden for such a
Yes,
small place.
It is, absolutely. It has increased the population of Kurdistan by almost 30%.
And near the front line, just north of Mosul, a city occupied by ISIS, is another potential disaster. Mosul Dam, which was built by Saddam Hussein's regime on weak foundations, has fallen into disrepair, and dangerously so. Engineers warn that it could break at any time. What would happen if the dam broke?
A large part of Mosul will be flooded in a matter of a few hours, and then anything on the way, all the way to Baghdad. It would take a few days to reach Baghdad, but it would be flooded, everything on the way.
The US says it could trigger a 45-foot-high flood wave on the River Tigris, endangering the lives of 1.5 million people in a part of the world already suffering the effects of another man-made catastrophe.
The president talked with us about his foreign policy Monday at the White House. We sat down after officials announced another 200 American troops will be sent to Iraq. They will help local forces try to recapture a key city from ISIS.
This is a long, hard fight, as I just said last week, but what we've seen is they've lost territory, and as we see the Iraqis willing to fight and gaining ground, let's make sure that we're providing them more support. We're not doing the fighting ourselves, but when we provide training, when we provide special forces who are backing them up, when we are gaining intelligence, working with the coalitions that we have, what we've seen is that we can continually tighten the noose. My expectation is that by the end of the year, we will have created the conditions whereby Mosul will eventually fall.
When you arrived in office, I think one of the early things you said to the CIA director is, I want to get Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
And you did.
Yeah.
I assume you feel the same way about Baghdadi.
I feel the same way about the entire ISIL leadership structure, which is as wicked and as destructive as any group of individuals on this planet.
And do you think you'll be able to get Baghdadi by the end of your term?
My goal is to make sure that we're doing things right, and we've got a plan, and we execute. You take bin Laden as an example. I would like to have gotten him this first year.
Yeah.
Well, but you don't have that luxury as president. What you have the ability to do is to put in train all the pieces, intelligence, military, diplomatic, and you just keep on grinding it out.
Now to another major American military campaign against ISIS. Yesterday, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced that some 200 more American troops would soon go to Iraq, pushing the American strength there to over 4,000. The U.S. will also send Apache fast attack helicopters, which will help protect the Iraqi army as it begins its advance on the ISIS-held city of Mosul. The U.S. also announced more than $400 million in aid to the Kurdish Peshmerga forces in northern Iraq. For more on all this and the wider war against ISIS, I'm joined by President Obama's special envoy to the coalition fighting ISIS, Brett McGurk. Welcome back to the program. Why is the president sending these additional U.S. advisors?
Well, the president really instructed our team about 4 or 5 months ago to do all we can to accelerate the campaign. And it took a while, Judy, to get particularly the Iraqi forces in place to be able to stand up, maneuver, conduct offensive operations. And we're now seeing some success. They liberated Ramadi just last week. They liberated a really critical strategic town called Al-Hit, just to the west of Ramadi in the center of the Euphrates Valley. It's been a stronghold of ISIL, and they liberated that last week. And what we're now in position to do with the Iraqi security forces is conduct pressure against ISIL on multiple simultaneous fronts. That's the Euphrates Valley in Anbar province, where operations will continue, and now beginning up towards Mosul. So this is really a package that's been in development for some time, and we think it will give the Iraqis some unique capabilities as it moves on Mosul. Mosul is a little different than Ramadi. Logistically, the Iraqis have to travel a little further than they're usually used to. So we'll be helping with logistics, we'll be helping with sustainment, and of course when they come into combat, we'll be ready to support them with Apache helicopters and some other enablers.
But sending U.S. forces or U.S. advisors closer to the front lines, is this an acknowledgement that the Iraqi military is really not able to do the job alone?
No, it's really, you have to look at the topography of the battlefield. In Ramadi, for example, when Ramadi fell, the president ordered a detachment of U.S. Special Forces to Takatam Air Base, which is sandwiched right in between Ramadi and Fallujah. It's only about 25 kilometers or so from the front lines. Mosul is, we have to be with the Iraqis in their headquarters, and their headquarters, as they move towards Mosul, will change. They'll be kind of mobile. So we'll be with the Iraqi commanders advising and assisting what they're doing, which is very similar to what we did in Anbar province. But in Anbar, where we have two facilities, it's a little more stationary. So we're on base, we're advising and assisting. In Mosul, it'll be a little more dynamic. So we want to make sure that our best advisors are with the headquarters, with the Iraqi commanders, as they're planning and conducting their operations.
Is it fair to call this mission creep?
No, it's the exact same mission in Mosul that we've been doing in Anbar province. It's just, we're moving into the phase in Mosul now. It's the same mission. The only difference is Apache helicopters, but we were prepared to use Apache helicopters. The president authorized it for Ramadi, but given the situation, given the fact that the Iraqis were having an awful lot of success, and given the urban environment, we determined that it really wasn't needed. But in Mosul, it's a complex terrain. It's the citadel of Daesh. They're well defended there. So we think Apaches can make a difference. We discussed this with the Iraqi government. Everything we do in Iraq is with the consent of the Iraqi government. This is something Prime Minister Abadi wanted, and we found a formula that we think will be effective.
Well, let me ask you about some criticism we're hearing from the other side. The NewsHour spoke today with retired Army Colonel Derek Harvey, who, as you know, advised General David Petraeus in Iraq for a number of years. He told us he thinks these steps represent insufficient resources in the first place by the administration and poor execution by the administration working with the Iraqis.
Well, I worked in Iraq with David Petraeus back in those days too, and Ambassador Crocker. It's a different time now. We're not fighting the war. The Iraqis are fighting the war. We're in the middle of liberating all of Anbar province. Again, we liberated Ramadi. That was done with Iraqis. We're now moving west up the Euphrates Valley. That is being done with Iraqis. The strategic town of Al-Hid is critical because it opens up a free expressway from Ramadi to Haditha. There's a town of Haditha which has been under siege by Daesh for almost 2 years. We're now in position to break that siege. So we're having an awful lot of success. It's a different campaign than it was in 2007, 2008. Americans are not doing the fighting. We are advising, we're assisting, we're providing devastating air support and special operations. There are things we, of course, don't talk about much. We have special operations and special forces in northern Iraq. They're very effective against the leadership of Daesh. And so, they're doing a great job. And everything we do, again, Judy, is with the consent of the Iraqi government. This is not a situation in which, we're an occupying force. It's a very, very different, much more complex, much more challenging situation than 2007. But we believe that the most sustainable way to do this is to get the Iraqis fighting, to empower locals.
But you can understand why people look at this and they see more troops going, they see Apache helicopters going, and they want to know what's going on.
Secretary of Defense Ash Carter revealed several new U.S. contributions to the fight against Islamic State Monday during an unannounced visit to Baghdad. Carter said the U.S. will provide Apache helicopters, highly mobile rocket launchers, and more U.S. troops on the ground.
We are going to place additional advisors with the Iraqi security forces now down to brigade and battalion headquarters.
Carter met with the Iraqi Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, who both agreed to the new U.S. provisions. He said the extra American advisors will be important as Iraqi forces relocate northward toward Mosul.
So we want more action by Iraqi forces towards victory here, and more action will require more logistics, and so that'll be an important part of this gathering momentum.
Carter's announcement includes $415 million for Kurdish Peshmerga forces, whose government is suffering financial woes due to a tumble in oil prices.
Right now, the Peshmerga are not getting enough calories to keep them in the field. So we're very interested in making sure that they have enough food just to carry on the fight.
Officials say that while accelerants announced Monday will hopefully escalate the anti-Islamic State fight, the new measures also could potentially expose Americans on the ground to greater risk closer to the front line.
We're following some new details on an American military service member killed in Iraq. We've learned that a Navy SEAL died fighting ISIS just north of Mosul. It happened when militants overran Kurdish troops. This is the third American to be killed in direct combat since the U.S.-led coalition launched its fight against the terror group in 2014. David Martin is at the Pentagon. David, what are your sources telling you about exactly how this Navy SEAL died?
Well, this was a very violent firefight. This happened along a front line between ISIS and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces that stretches all the way across northern Iraq, and for which the most part has been very quiet in the last several weeks. And these, a team of American advisors, to include that Navy SEAL, was visiting the Peshmerga forces, seeing if they had everything they needed. And they were in the rear area, about 2-3 miles back from the front line, when all of a sudden ISIS mounted a major attack on that point in the Peshmerga front line. They hit the front line with 3 truck bombs, followed that up with bulldozers to clear away the debris, and then went straight for the rear area. And they still had 2 truck bombs with them. The U.S. was able to call in airstrikes, and airstrikes destroyed those 2 truck bombs, but there was still a firefight in this camp, and that's when the Navy SEAL was killed by small arms fire. And it took a total of 23 airstrikes to finally drive the ISIS fighters back, get in a medevac to take out the Navy SEAL, but it was too late to save him. This tells you, although the Americans were there almost by coincidence because they just move from camp to camp, checking on individual units as they go, we don't know if ISIS had some tip that Americans were there at the time of the attack. But either way, this tells you the troops over there are in harm's way, and the tide may be turning against ISIS, but ISIS still remains a dangerous and deadly enemy.
David, remind our viewers before I let you go why this area of northern Iraq, Mosul specifically, is so important to this mission.
Well, Mosul is the key city in Iraq, still held by ISIS. And if Iraq is going to be successful in expelling ISIS from its territory, it has to retake Mosul. And so these front lines with the Peshmerga, the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north, are part of this effort to envelop the city of Mosul prior to an offensive against Mosul, which is going to be a major fight, which may begin this year or may not. The preparations for this are going to be extensive, and they're nowhere near complete.
David Martin reporting from the Pentagon. David, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Dramatic new battlefield video appears to show the intense firefight with ISIS that killed an American Navy SEAL in Iraq. The deadly firefight took place north of Mosul. Holly Williams is in Istanbul, Turkey. Holly, good morning.
Good morning. This new video appears to show part of the intense battle around the Iraqi town of Tel Aviv after it was attacked by more than 100 ISIS fighters, including some suicide bombers. The video shows a convoy of vehicles coming under fire, US troops and the Kurdish fighters they're supporting apparently running for cover, and we also see what appears to be a US Black Hawk helicopter bearing medical insignia. As we know, Petty Officer First Class Charles Keating was shot during that battle. He was medevaced out by helicopter but later died. The third US combat death in Iraq since this fight against ISIS began. There are around 5,000 US service members in Iraq, mostly working as military advisors, and the US says that this is not a combat mission. But this video seems to clearly show that at least some of those American troops are involved in combat.
Islamic State militants launched a major attack Tuesday on the town of Tel Aviv, that is just to the north of the Iraqi city of Mosul. The small town was held by Kurdish Peshmerga forces and a local Christian militia, but Islamic State fighters were able to take control of Tel Aviv.
The town is now surrounded by our forces. We are currently at the entrance to the town. They sent some suicide bombers to us. They have snipers inside the town. We are waiting for the 0 hour to launch an offensive against Daesh.
Local witnesses say the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes played an important part in slowing the IS offensive. It helped the Kurdish forces to retreat and regroup outside the town. But there were casualties. This Kurdish fighter says the IS attack came about 5 in the morning.
They were well equipped. We were outgunned. We only had 2 BKC guns. When their Hammer vehicle entered, our shield wall collapsed. We couldn't do anything. We had to retreat.
The Kurdistan Region Security Council said via Twitter late Tuesday that Tel Aviv has been cleared with help from coalition airstrikes. For Kawa Omar near Mosul, Iraq.
Now to that stunning new video. Americans under attack in a firefight with ISIS. Navy SEAL Charles Keating killed in that battle, and ABC's Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz has new details. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, George. We have not seen such an up-close view of Americans in battle since the U.S. returned to Iraq almost 2 years ago. The White House has called the ground forces non-combat troops, but this dramatic video shows what non-combat can look like. The convoy of U.S. vehicles attacked by ISIS fighters on the road. This just...
IS fighters breached the Kurdish front line in northern Iraq in a surprise multi-pronged attack, trapping a small team of U.S. advisors. Navy SEAL Charles Keating was part of the quick reaction force sent in to extract them. Keating was reportedly killed by enemy fire near this vehicle.
The fighting started, and that was when an American was martyred by an Islamic State sniper. There was only 20 meters between me and him.
Ground forces and U.S. airstrikes eventually pushed IS back. Burnt-out vehicles and bodies were left behind.
The Americans were with us minute by minute. They even fought. Their presence here boosted our morale.
Navy SEAL Keating is the third U.S. serviceman to have been killed in Iraq in the fight against IS.
داخل تلسقوف بونمش دو کاتین هم مجاز بون هم هاتین حوالنا گاز تلفن مکرین وتشرع سرما وداعش داخل تلسقوف بون وقتی امریکا تشهید کردن لبر دیواری تشهید کردن تناصر با 20 حتی 30 متر رنج بر انا یس ویلای شهر ما و ویلای ما ولی لا کدو شفت بن
In Iraq, there is fierce fighting outside Mosul, a city of 2 million. the largest city controlled by ISIS. Iraq's army and Kurdish forces trained by the U.S. had been planning to retake Mosul, but they have been delayed time and again. Holly Williams went to the front lines.
20 miles from Mosul, these Kurdish soldiers are jumpy. This was the response when they spotted 2 suspected ISIS gunmen approaching their post. The day before, ISIS managed to break through the front line in its biggest attack here in months. The Kurdish soldiers pushed them back and told us they killed nearly 100 fighters. Crossing into no man's land, we inspected all that remained of a Humvee, detonated by the suicide bomber driving it. Blew up. Just one driver inside? ISIS will doubtless use the same ruthless tactics to defend Mosul. ISIS is thought to have several thousand fighters in Mosul, but now they're stopping civilians from leaving the city, which means effectively that ISIS has more than 1 million human shields. When ISIS swept across northern Iraq nearly 2 years ago, Iraqi soldiers ran away. Now American troops are back, training the National Army to retake the city. Colonel Scott Nauman, an American advisor to the Iraqi military, told us this time the U.S. coalition has shaped a different army.
The skills that they've received, small unit tactics, how to breach minefields, how to defeat improvised explosive devices, these are skills that they didn't have previously.
But will they stay the course? General Najim al-Jabari told us he'll lead the Mosul offensive when it finally begins.
I think about 75 or 80% from the people in Mosul, they will support us.
80% will support you,
yeah.
but 20% are still supporting ISIS.
Yeah, with ISIS.
But just after that, a phone call from the Iraqi Ministry of Defense ordered the general to stop the interview, perhaps because the timing of the Mosul offensive is so sensitive. But Scott, a U.S. intelligence official, told Congress last month that it's unlikely Mosul will be recaptured before next year.
Holly Williams reporting from northern Iraq tonight. Holly, thank you.
We're afraid of the army, and we're afraid of ISIS. We can't tell foe from friend.
Over the last few weeks, attempts by Iraqi forces to push ISIS out of villages near here, 60 miles southeast of Mosul, has led more than 3,000 people to flee their homes. Many have arrived at this makeshift camp in Makmur, not knowing who to trust. And now as the Iraqi army continues its push towards Mosul, this may be just the beginning of another flood of desperate refugees.
We are concerned about other families. There are thousands of families in hundreds of villages.
Hadi Khalaf Hassan, an elementary school teacher, experienced life under ISIS and then a sudden takeover by the Iraqi army firsthand.
ISIS fighters were hiding behind the walls. We were inside the buildings. The aircraft was bombing, and the army was advancing. You're inside your house, but you don't know who is behind the wall. Is it a soldier or an ISIS fighter? You are the prey in the middle.
And what was life like under ISIS before the takeover?
It was hell. You had to grow a beard. You had to wear Afghani-like clothes. You had to pray in the mosque. A lot of suffering.
Once Iraqi forces retook the town, the villagers, who were Sunni, said the mostly Shiite Iraqi troops were good to them the first day, but became rough soon after.
When the army gained control of the village, they called the people over loudspeakers to come out.
People got hit, people got injured, people got shot, people got stabbed, people got their cars burned.
The men say they were suspected of being ISIS sympathizers, but insisted that they aren't. While villagers paint a bleak picture of the Iraqi military's treatment, officials say the army is doing its best to handle missions that require both combat and humanitarian skills. But the villagers themselves disagree.
The soldiers are young. It's war. You can't blame them. But they should not have used violence against us this way. We had a white flag raised. We told them we had families with us. We were peaceful citizens.
Many here say that with ISIS and the Iraqi army continuing to fight over territory, they're afraid to go back home.
هوش بيش مرقية مساعدي برعانا وكما عندنا حيجون رياضاتنا شلون بطايقوا ده مبارانا هيدي ها بس دي يلا وسع نبقى بخير مساعداك الخيرة لو تشاكون
امامی پشمرگ جناب سروکینا حلال و حرام 20000 سال در بنا به تشکیل مناج هر بیجی کرد کردستان هر بیجی
أبا مرة داعشة والله ما صوت أكل بردوي كر دون ومرو في جيت ده هذا چند دونه زیج بی
هذا مدار داعش هذا وحيد كوفلي صاروخ بارپیچ یا پاکاندی چند نفر توت بابین همیت کشتین خویگ در باز.
The U.S. Air Force says that it started using B-52 bombers in the air campaign against Daesh terrorists in both Iraq and Syria. This comes as amid rising concerns about possible civilian casualties from the deployment. The U.S. Army Colonel Steve Warren said that a B-52 was sent to destroy an ISIL weapons storage facility in the Iraqi town of Aqayara on Monday. He rejected concerns that the use of the bomber would pose a greater risk of civilian casualties. Warren said the aircraft are only conducting precision strikes. The B-52, which is a standard aircraft for carpet bombing, has the capacity to carry up to 32,000 kilograms of weapons. Human rights groups and independent observers have reported hundreds of civilian deaths in the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria since the air campaign started back in August of 2014.
The first time the U.S. Air Force deploys a B-52 bomber to aid the fight against ISIS. The Pentagon announced the news on Wednesday, April 20th, and video footage released on Thursday showed the aircraft destroying an ISIS weapons storage facility in Iraq. The B-52 bomber struck the storage facility on Monday in the town of Keraya, which is about 35 miles south of the ISIS-controlled city of Mosul. The nuclear-capable aircraft can stay in the air for up to 10 hours at a time. It also carries a much larger payload than F-15 or F-16 fighter jets. The news of the B-52 bomber comes shortly after the U.S. agreed to deploy more than 200 troops to Iraq as well as Apache helicopters. The increased U.S. military support in Iraq is expected to help Iraqi forces in their operations to retake Mosul.
U.S. Air Force Boeing B-52H Stratofortress bombers landed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar on April 9th to replace the B-1B Lancer bomber in support of Operation Inherent Resolve against Islamic State forces in Syria and Iraq. The B-52 is a long-range heavy bomber that can perform a variety of missions, including strategic attack, close air support, air interdiction, and maritime operations. It carries a 70,000-pound payload and is a multi-role platform that can deliver precision-guided bombs, mines, missiles, and air-launched cruise missiles.
The first thing about the B-52 is just the historical presence that it carries with it. I think when the enemy sees the B-52 fly overhead, it strikes fear into their hearts. And that's something that we absolutely want to take advantage of. More importantly, the B-52 is well equipped in the fight that's taking place right now. We can drop a host of precision and near-precision munitions that are going to help us get the job done out there. So bringing the B-52 out here is definitely going to be a win for everybody, I think. All the B-52 crew members, the maintainers, and all the support that we have moved out here, we just can't wait to get to the fight. We can't wait to start the mission. We can't wait to support our coalition partners, our allies, and we're hoping we can make a big difference in this fight.
This is the first basing in the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility in a quarter of a century. CENTCOM's area covers 20 countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. The B-52s were last based in the region in 1991 when they were stationed in Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Storm, but have since been used in operations in Afghanistan and in exercises in Jordan.
confirmed. Engage. Engage. Be advised, friendlies. West in the high ground and south. That's over.
Alright, give me back in constraints. Come back to the left.
Roger that. Continue to engage. Continue to engage. Just be advised, friendlies on the high ground. Friendlies moving from the south. Over. Just give me a heads up where you're in from.
Be running 30 millimeter. He got 4 individuals. Got a whole bunch of guys right there maneuvering. We'll be engaging. I'll get back here up to 30. Alright.
Requesting immediate airstrike and the changing of the coordinates. Over. Requesting immediate fire support in the designated coordinates. Over. Requesting immediate fire support in the designated coordinates. Over.